This is Plays 1, and it features six theatre plays written between 1983 and 1988. The Waiting Room, 1983, 1979, which is the name of the play, which was written in 1984, The Bond, which was written in 1984, The Conformist, which was 1985, The Crossroads, which was written in 1984 stroke 85, and then finally London Cousins, which was written in 1988. Now, I can't read portions of each play in this DVD because uploading these to YouTube, even for a 5-minute film, takes about 2.5 hours. So rather than just reading sections from the play, what I'm going to do is just read the introduction to each play. The Waiting Room was written in 1983 when I was 19 years old. Influenced by the works of Pinter, Bond and Albee, it was a spontaneous outpouring of what it felt like to be an unemployed working-class kid living at home, as the political and social climate of the turbulent world of the Cold War, Thatcherism, inner-city riots, unemployment and strikes raged around me. I sat in the family front room when both parents were out at work, the portable Brother typewriter on a little table, with 4 distinct characters in my head and a location: a railway waiting room at Eaglescliffe Station. I used 100 times throughout 1982 and 1983 while working with a weekly drama group in a local secondary school, catching the train back to Darlington about 15 miles away. In the script, I recorded everything I knew and felt about the world I lived in at that time. That world was not as politically correct as the world we have today. Yes, I think writers and artists are happier with the world that we've created that employs all-inclusive terms for ethnic minorities and people with special needs. But back then, our world was dominated by racism and stereotyping, as practiced by a post-war white working class. I'd never written anything like this before in my young life, recorded honestly the terms I heard around me in the world I inhabited. I was paranoid that people would think I was championing racism, and it was a profound shock to my young mind to realize how courageous and how isolated a writer has to be in order to hit upon the truth. Television, not theatre, was the main inspiration for young actors in those days. Theatre was the closest medium we had to realize what we saw on our televisions. The actors in my play were all people I knew who attended weekly drama sessions at Darlington Youth Theatre. Our budget was zero, but we made it happen because we wanted to strike out and say something about the world we lived in, much as young punk and rock bands were doing. I've done some revising of the script since, and the revisions are in this version, but the majority of what we performed in 1983 is still here. The play was first performed on Friday the 18th of March 1983 at the Drama Centre in Darlington, which has since been demolished and replaced by luxury flats, under the group name Brevity Theatre. Brevity Theatre performed 3 plays in total: The Waiting Room, A Sense of Insecurity, and Norm and Ahmed. The first 2 written by me, the second one Lost Without Trace, and the third by Australian playwright Alex Buzo. The cast was The Stranger, played by me, Dad, Mark Gatiss, Mam, Louise Staveley, Trevor, Les Williamson, and the poster design was by Paul Dillon. And I have told Paul that I would say Paul Dillon Photography. This image is copyrighted by him, and you have to ask his permission to use it. I got his permission because I paid him to actually use it, which is the decent thing to do. Then 1979. 1979 was first called A Sheltered Life and was mainly written in 1984 and covered the years from my leaving school in July 79 up until June 84. Boys from the Black Stuff by Alan Bleasdale on television, the books Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence and A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, not the film by Stanley Kubrick, the Cold War, my school experiences and aspects of my own working class life, location, unemployment and general observations about the political and economic backdrop of that period inspired it. Between 1979 and 1985, I became politicized. The play has never been performed. Perhaps that's partly due to the large cast. I think it was probably the 3rd or 4th play I'd written by then. I hadn't written it with a budget or a small cast in mind. I'd just written it as it had unfolded in my imagination. I was discovering the work of Bertolt Brecht and Edward Bond at the time. I'd been to the theatre to see The Caucasian Chalk Circle by Brecht, and I loved the idea of actors hanging around quite visible at the fringe of the action and appearing in a focused space on stage when needed. The rap on page 66 came about because I was writing a lot of poetry at the time, and in total there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 characters, and it was never performed. Perhaps that's why. Next was the Bond, which was written in 1984. To be accused of plagiarism is probably only true in certain cases in which one storyline is substituted for another with slight name changes. History is littered with this. But what happens when borderline notions, places, names, situations, and atmospheres of certain arts, dance, literature, theatre, cinema, poetry, what happens when those things spill over into and influence and inspire others in their name? Does a writer need to kill someone before he writes about a character that kills someone? What are we imagining? How are we imagining it? I wrote large tracts of this story back in 1984, but only with the passing of time and by tasting for myself certain experiences in that past have I been able to write with more conviction. The exchange of a glass on page 123 is taken from Pinter's The Homecoming, and I used it as Ruth in The Homecoming used it with Lenny. In my version, the younger, dominated Brian is seduced by his brother Roger's authority and power, even though he's not 100% sure the man who has walked back into his life after a 30-year absence truly is his brother, as an accident and time has altered perceptions. I'm interested in exploring opposing attitudes of people from the same backgrounds and class or close family leading similar lives until a certain age, and, because of circumstance or choice, experiencing a rupture that leads to different paths, one staying where they were and the other going out and travelling the world. But which has the better life? There's the added tension of a bitter rivalry between the two brothers, Brian the oldest and Roger the youngest, and jealousy over the love of a woman called Ma. The challenge in the play as a writer was how to achieve these seemingly ambitious goals within the recognizable context of a working class urban landscape. The next play I wrote after that was The Conformist, which was my first venture into a one-man show, which was in 1985. Adapted from the novel by Alberto Moravia, The Conformist was my first foray into the art of the one-man show, presented under the name of the Poor Theatre, because I was, very much so. I was 21 and found myself without actors, having been expelled from Darlington Youth Theatre because I broke away to make the waiting room after we were forced to rehearse on a few evenings that conflicted with the Darlington Youth Theatre. Having seen the film of the same name by Bernardo Bertolucci, I wanted to use the book as a contrast between the fascist years of Italy and the then current years of Thatcher's Britain. Reading the book, seeing the film, and writing my own version helped me to understand how ordinary people fool themselves into becoming puppets. The character is Marcello Clerici, a product of Italian middle-class civil servants, who, because of a childhood sin, becomes obsessed with the idea that the only way to make the sin right again is to devote himself to a life of normality, which at that time meant adhering fervently to the accepted political norm, which was Mussolini's fascism. Only after Mussolini's downfall in 1943 does Marcello come face to face with the truth that he committed no sin at all, and thus his entire life had been wasted on an illusion. Only in later years did I discover that the book was based on the truth that fascists assassinated Moravia's cousins in France in 1937. It's easy to judge with hindsight and say, oh yes, look at that terrible thing that person did. If I'd been in their shoes, I would have taken the courageous, heroic route. But at the time, and caught up in events, it's easy to see how people accept roles without consequences. In 1985, Thatcher was on a roll, having beaten the Argentines, the miners, the unions, and most elements of anti-establishment radicals, and let loose a new breed upon the world, the yuppies. Just as those Italians and Germans were blinded by the short-term euphoria and ambiguity of the dictatorships, so the yuppies of the mid-80s took the choice of disconnecting their actions from the moral responsibility they owed to millions of working citizens whose hard work and sweat funded their greed. It was my first effort at breaking down an artwork by another artist and in another form and adapting it for my own needs. I must confess that much of the thinking and writing I did in 1985 was flawed and lacked experience. As a piece for an actor, the props were sparse, non-existent in fact. All was accomplished through mime and characterization. The version that is printed here is a rework undertaken in 2008 by a much wiser performer and writer who knew what a seasoned actor was capable of doing and what a good theatre space could mould. It was performed 5 times in Darlington in 1985, and in September of that year I began a 3-year course as an actor at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London. And then finally, there's London. There is the Crossroads, and the Crossroads was written in 1985, 1984. I'll explain it very quickly. The Crossroads was started in late 1984 and stopped in early 1985. It took a while because of the direction my life was taking at the time, both as a person and as an aspiring writer. I started to look towards London and drama school as an escape from what felt like a kind of prison, being unknown in a small town, having very limited options to get educated to one's career choice. I was also aware of an urge to start writing more challenging and provocative plays that touched on subjects other than those I was familiar with, such as politics. But I was also aware that it felt almost inevitable that I'd end up in London at some point. I felt sure being a playwright was going to be extra baggage, when as an actor I envisaged travelling light. I began to wonder if my writing up to that point had indeed been mediocre, to say the least, and I'd just used the medium to keep myself busy until a better opportunity turned up, like using writing, even bad writing, modelling or singing careers to get into the back door of acting. I was too young at that time to get any perspective. Another determining factor was that on British television at that time there was a popular but ridiculed for its amateurishness soap opera called Crossroads. It featured a motel and a particularly gormless character, the infamous Benny. So I felt sure my own, of a similar title, would receive mocking comparisons. But nonetheless, this Crossroads, mine, not the TV Crossroads, and the characters in it became symbolic of the world I knew, the world I lived in, and the world of my future. It was a play about choices. At some point in its creation, I got confused and accidentally convinced myself that I didn't finish the play, stuffing the tightly packed typewritten lines over 18 sides into a drawer with a reminder to come back to it. With modern spacing techniques on my word processor, it eventually came out to an impressive 50 sides. But I never did return to it as other things came along in my life. It wasn't until the winter of 2020 that I looked more closely at the sheaf of yellowing papers and saw the clumsy work of 36 years ago, almost as a kind of message from the young, inexperienced me to the older, wiser me, trusting in the me of the future to one day decipher and unravel it and make something of it, when both writing and experience, and of course better technology, prevailed. This is it. Plays 1.